What does it mean to be human? It's a question that has been asked for thousands of years, since the days of ancient Greek philosophers, and perhaps before. It's a question that still continues to fascinate us as we face a rapidly changing world where AI and robotics have become more and more advanced and human-like. And it's one of the fundamental questions at the heart of Cyberpunk 2077. It's a question that is never far away from the consciousness, as it plays a significant role in defining both the main narrative, side quests, and the world in which it's set. One could argue that the game serves as a case study for the human condition in a world dominated by technology and its powerful benefactors, with the all-important question at its heart: what does it mean to be human? And yet, despite this, it's a question that the game never truly answers. Because how could it? Despite the game's lofty ambitions and enormous scope, both in its world and story, the question of what does it mean to be human is just too vast and open-ended to be given a definitive answer. Sure, there are elements that are consistent across the board, but how one views these consistencies is even at the mercy of personal interpretation. In a game like Cyberpunk 2077, which serves in conjunction as a case study of the human condition in the extreme crushing circumstances that is its world, there are still too many variables to consider to properly answer such an all-encompassing question. Other games have certainly broached the subject with varied amounts of success, but Cyberpunk 2077's grim, morally questionable techno-hell of a world, born out of the tabletop game written by Mike Pondsmith, as well as the characters within it, has so far provided the best commentary on this very subject. Such is the subject of this video, where we'll be exploring elements of Cyberpunk 2077 as they pertain to that very question, how it can be subdivided upon itself, how it broaches the subject in a meaningful way, and how, in a world so cruel and inhuman, we can find humanity amidst it all. Let's begin this exploration by understanding, or at least getting acquainted with, one of the all-important themes and concepts of not just Cyberpunk 2077, but of cyberpunk as a genre: transhumanism. But what is transhumanism? In a word, it's a philosophical and intellectual belief that advocates for the use of technology, both current and emerging, to overcome the fundamental limitations of humankind, to improve the human condition, the replacement of organic limbs for robotic ones, or the application of technologies that would slow or outright halt aging as the most basic examples. Transhumanists believe that, with the responsible application of such technologies, the human race can exceed its natural limitations, with lifespan increases and improved cognitive and sensory capabilities being the main goal. They also propose that humans who partake in these augmentations will eventually evolve into an advanced species that will transcend what we know as humans today, the post-human. Transhumanists also believe that the use of such technologies can be used to eliminate a myriad number of diseases, or potentially provide solutions to urgent issues plaguing our world. Brain chips, for example, have been proposed as a means to cure or overcome neurological diseases, such as dementia or paralysis. The direct replacement of natural organs for synthetic ones, in the event of organ failure or disease, is also suggested, and even possible throughout Cyberpunk 2077. Coupled with those elements, transhumanist scholars and philosophers also argue that there's a natural tendency among humans to want perfection, particularly with regards to improving the human condition. As such, physical augmentation, be it of the mind or the body, is the next step of human evolution, though it will no longer be natural, but voluntary and deliberate, a directed evolution. In Cyberpunk 2077, we see this proposed future for humanity in the form of Chrome, the oft-used slang term for cybernetic implants and prosthetics. From the destitute of Kabuki to the most powerful megacorp executives, nearly everyone in Night City is sporting some amount of chrome. In fact, it's become so prevalent that not sporting any chrome is seen as strange, even off-putting.
Mind if I ask why you don't sport any chrome?
I love machines, V, I do. But I don't ever want to become one. Is that weird?
A little, I guess, but it's fine.
Everything that transhumanists hope for in the future, one way or another, has come to fruition here. Soldiers who have lost limbs can live out their normal lives with cybernetic prosthetics, organs can be replaced in a snap, humans can now live centuries instead of just decades, dementia and similar neurological diseases are practically non-existent. On the surface, it appears like a transhumanist paradise where humanity is no longer bound to the limitations of slow, laborious natural evolution, where we are now the masters of our own advancement as a species. And yet there's one key element of the transhumanist philosophy that is conspicuously missing here. Earlier I mentioned that a part of the transhumanist philosophy is the responsible application of these technologies. In Cyberpunk 2077, and often in most cyberpunk works, this is practically non-existent. While the utilitarian aspect of implantation and cybernetic replacement does exist, it's heavily washed with the excess that dominates this setting, a result of humanity's sudden dependence on Chrome, the desire to get chipped. For some, it's become a fad, a fashion. They see the biggest celebrities, the rich and famous, sporting the latest implants and prosthetics, and they need to have it. Is there a utilitarian reason for it? Probably not, but who cares? In Night City, aesthetics and the impression they leave matter more than anything. It's form over function. For others, and probably most crucially as it pertains to this discussion, each implant carries a more sinister purpose. A stepping stone up the perilous ladder that is Night City's volatile hierarchy, a building block to greater power. Coinciding with the incessant conflicts between the city's gangs and megacorps, there's a never-ending cyberware arms race, one that puts immense strain on the already fragile balance of power, a balance barely held together by the city's power brokers, namely its fixers, who themselves are part of this volatile hierarchy and arms race. In this excess, the question of one's humanity becomes a murky one. All too often you'll come across characters, both in missions and out on the street, that begs the question, where does the machine end and the human begin? Conversely, and almost ironically, with the proliferation of complex AIs that bear what we would consider human characteristics and emotional responses in this world, the question of where does the human end and the machine begin is also appropriate. To add to this confusing mess, there are those who qualify for both, the line between human and machine having become so blurred it's practically indistinguishable.
You look like a cut of fuckable meat, are you?
Evelyn.
Lizzie Wizzy and Adam Smasher both fall under this, the extent of their modifications clear to see, appearing as cyborgs and nothing more. Yet they still bear human-esque traits, even if, as is the case with Smasher, they are the worst of the worst. They also represent the two sides of the coin representing this chrome excess, fashion and power. While this excess is more of a creation of the cyberpunk genre, we can see one of transhumanism's greatest criticisms made reality, that with each implantation, with every piece of cyberware, a piece of humanity is removed in exchange. Flesh becomes metal, blood becomes oil and coolant, and we eventually return to the question, where does the machine end and the human begin? Of course, not every aspect that is human strictly pertains to the physical body. An individual's mind and personality is just as important as the person's physical appearance in determining one's humanity. Yet the mind too is not safe from the excesses of this twisted transhumanist future. Like a drug, you can become addicted to chrome, to getting chipped, and those who push their bodies to the limits of its cybernetic capacity inevitably stare down the smoking gun that is Night City's greatest fear, cyberpsychosis. Once this threshold is reached, there's no turning back. The mind cracks, twisted by the implants, and the individual loses all sense of what it means to be human. There is no known cure to cyberpsychosis, and the end result is usually the cyberpsycho being brutally taken down by the authorities, most notably MaxTac, though not before, more often than not, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. One would think that, to at least help the situation, a sort of legal limit on Chrome applications would be put in place. In a world dominated by the free market and a dependence on Chrome, however, such an idea would no doubt lead to heads rolling, not least at the hands of the mega corporations who produce the most widely available Chrome, that which advertisements for light up the Night City skyline. Profit has become more important than human morality and consciousness, a basic premise, but a powerful one nonetheless. There is no doubt that there are many potential benefits to a transhumanist future, where death and disease is practically eradicated, and where loss of limb is no longer catastrophic and crippling, at least in the long term. We'd also be remiss to assume that transhumanists would look upon this twisted, grim envisioning of their desired future and not be disgusted by what they see.
Oh, fuck.
Impressive, isn't it?
After all, as mentioned before, transhumanists desire a responsible application of these sorts of technologies. Yet it's difficult to ignore just how much transhumanist ideals, cybernetic augmentation, and humanity's dependence on Chrome has had on creating this debased version of the future. Case in point, the fashion and power dynamic, and the lack of responsible application of such technologies. It conjures an interesting yet troubling and difficult to answer question, one of a few that will be asked throughout this video. How much is someone willing to sacrifice their humanity in the name of cybernetic enhancement, and to what ends? Only the individual can answer, and even they may not even know, until it's too late. When analyzing the matter of one's humanity in Cyberpunk 2077, it's difficult to downplay the importance and influence of its setting, Night City. This is in large part due to the city being a major driving force in enforcing many of the things you see as you meander down its streets, slink through its alleyways, joyride with companions, or engage in its myriad activities. Conversely, it can be said that the opposite is true, that what happens here only reinforces the reputation and symbolism that Night City bears. Night City is one of the most fascinating open world settings I've ever explored, in most part thanks to just how well it reinforces many of the game's narrative themes and concepts. It's not perfect in every aspect, no two ways about it, but its presentation and place within the story makes up for many of its shortcomings. From the outside, it appears like any other city, including those of our world. It has its downtown core, centers of industry, tourist hotspots, popular shopping areas, and neighborhoods that range from towering apartment and condo complexes to outlying suburbs and terraced housing. These are subdivided by various districts, which are then further subdivided by neighborhoods, determined by the collective wealth and social standing of their inhabitants. At least that's how it appears. There's also the outskirts of the city, the Badlands, intersected to the east by the interstate that cuts across the North American continent, the oil fields to the north beyond Watson, or the automated Biotechnica plantations and solar fields in Jackson Plains to the south. In all these areas, two worlds, the old and the new, come together, both complementing and clashing with one another. A fairly standard city from the outside, not uncommon to what we have in the real world. Once we reach the nitty-gritty, however, and begin to explore its inner workings is when we truly enter the belly of the beast, and the similarities end. This is one of the most brutally cruel game worlds ever created, and that goes for the tabletop game as well, since Cyberpunk 2077 takes directly from it as source material. Behind the vibrant glow of its neon lights, this cruelty runs in parallel with the depravity and poverty that runs rampant in its streets. These aren't some sores that the powers that be have attempted to cover up, but wide open wounds, festering and rotting. This is a city whose streets are ruled by the law of the jungle, where its largest gangs fight constant battles for control of the city's various districts and neighborhoods. Falling through the cracks left behind are smaller but no less brutal gangs, such as the Scavs or the nomadic wraiths out in the Badlands. Their influence and presence is by far the most direct and inescapable, often with dire consequences, intended or otherwise. Looming over them in Night City are the corporations, with armies and resources matching or exceeding that of entire nations, as evidenced by both Arasaka and Militech. That said, their influence, while also inescapable and hard to miss, is far more withdrawn and reserved, though they're unafraid to use brute force when necessary. Their preference to pulling strings in boardrooms and in the halls of power makes them, arguably, a far more menacing element in this world's power hierarchy. Binding this volatile ecosystem together are the edge runners, the solos, the street ninjas, the mercs. Individuals or groups who, along with the fixers that keep them employed, maintain the fragile balance of power that keeps Night City from falling into anarchy. There's no united core among them, and thus they're scattered across all levels of the hierarchy, each with the sole objective of becoming a legend. Combine all these elements and you have a city that's a ticking time bomb. And who's left suffering? The ordinary, everyday people, of course. Those whose lives are a constant struggle against crushing poverty, corporate oppression, and incessant gang violence. Death is never far away and can come from anywhere, sometimes in the most gruesome ways. But what does all that have to do with what it means to be human? In simple terms, like we discussed when it came to Chrome and cybernetic augmentation, it's a question of how low someone will stoop to survive in this sort of world. How much of their humanity is someone willing to sacrifice to simply live in a city like this? The violence that Night City's law of the jungle perpetuates does not discriminate, and it's not uncommon for casualty figures of a recent shootout to include civilian casualties numbering in the tens, sometimes even in the hundreds. This puts the ordinary citizens in the unfortunate position of being active but unwilling agents in the city's violent power structure. And this just isn't a question asked of the lower and middle class. Even in the wealthiest districts and neighborhoods, such as Charter Hill and North Oak, the upper class, especially corpos, are subject to this law of the jungle as well. Sure, they aren't at the greatest risk all the time, but that could change in an instant, especially in the clandestine world of corporate espionage, something we see in the opening segment of the Corpo life path. This has resulted in Night City's government strongly encouraging its citizens to openly carry, a situation made more dire by the Night City police being unable to keep up with the gang violence and corporate corruption, with any attempt by honest cops to solve the city's biggest issues stymied by incompetence and more corruption. If the law of the jungle determines that the most brutal and ruthless are the ones that will reach the top, then the same can be said as it pertains to simply surviving. Those who are the most willing to commit unspeakable acts in the name of survival are the likeliest to do so, but at the cost of a piece of themselves. As we asked earlier, how much of your humanity are you willing to sacrifice just to survive? In steps V, through whose eyes we see Night City's law of the jungle unfold, the volatile ecosystem play out, and as Merc themselves actively participate in it, with the express intent of reaching the top, of becoming a legend. The survivability aspect for them is made more acute thanks to events in the main story, but by and large it's the same for V as it is for almost everyone else, made narratively better by V not being a typical chosen one archetype. As the player character, we determine V's actions throughout both the main story and many side missions and gigs we find out in the world. While observable in other characters we meet, the question of this chapter, as well as the question it stems from, is best observed from V's perspective, given the first-person view and the direct control we have. As you explore Night City and engage in its ecosystem, you will constantly be put in volatile situations that will test the limits of your survivability. You've taken a job to steal or collect some goods, but there's a whole host of enemies in the way. Do you try to sneak around, taking out only those you absolutely need to? If so, lethally or non-lethally? Or do you just run in guns blazing, mantis blades slashing, killing all in your path? The NCPD have been called and have you backed into a corner. Do you run and hide, wait them out? Or do you make a stand and fight back, right up until max hack is called, even at the risk of civilian casualties? And once the dust settles, do you revel in the violence? Do you slink back home, sickened by what you've done? Or do you just shrug your shoulders and say to yourself, I did what I had to survive? Regardless of the scenario, Night City doesn't give you an easy way out, the only options being how low and depraved you're willing to go just to survive. How much of your humanity are you willing to sacrifice? In V's case, the existential threat they're facing, along with the desire to be a legend in Night City, puts their humanity and that of your own as the one influencing these decisions in sharper perspective. Night City is a horrible, horrible place. A city, according to some, abandoned by all the gods. And yet there is, if you look hard enough, a slender ray of hope and happiness amidst the bloody darkness, and it can be found in the people who call the city home. Despite the crushing conditions they're subjected to, the law of the jungle's unbreakable stranglehold over day-to-day life, you'll meet characters who continue to hope, to believe, to live. This is a city full of horrible people who have and or continue to do horrible things, some of whom V may be able to render judgment upon, but it's those who persevere in the face of this and continue on living to show their humanity and compassion who give off the hope of a better future for Night City. Even after experiencing soul-crushing grief, personal or familial turmoil, or an extended period of self-doubt, they still go on. Even characters who we should be viewing with contempt show flashes of humanity, or perhaps strive to be examples of humanity and its best traits to better what they used to be, even if their end goals are skewed or if their methodology is completely whack. In a world where everything, including cybernetics, has become fetishized or made marketable, where almost everyone has some sort of nihilistic view of the world and themselves, perpetuated by corporate homogenization of the individual, it's through these characters we see that compassion, friendship, and even love can exist, traits that are often considered essential to what it is to be human. It's here that the question of humanity as it pertains to Night City becomes blurred, and like it does with regards to cybernetic enhancement, it depends on the individual. But there is one thing that is made clear. There is humanity to be found in a city so horrible. You're just gonna have to dig really, really deep to find it.
I saw a corpse strip farmers of water, and eventually of land. Saw them transform Night City into a machine fueled by people's crushed spirits, broken dreams, and emptied pockets.
So by now, if you've gotten this far into the video, you're probably beginning to wonder, aren't you missing something? Or someone? Doubtless you're referring to everyone's favorite rocker boy, Johnny Silverhand. I say favorite in a rather tongue-in-cheek fashion because while there are many people who find him endearing, or at least like some part of his personality or beliefs, myself included, at the end of the day, he's still a massive piece of shit.
So unless you got a better one, like I said, go fuck yourself!
It's impossible not to talk about what it means to be human in Cyberpunk 2077 without discussing Johnny, and that of the biochip and soul killer, for their implications with regards to humanity are the driving force behind the main plot. Let's start with a quick recap. Johnny is a rocker boy and self-declared rebel who, after being captured detonating a nuclear bomb in Arasaka Tower in 2023, had his consciousness scanned and copied onto an engram on the orders of Saburo Arasaka, keeping his consciousness alive in a digitized form, but killing his body. His engram was then stored in Mikoshi, an Arasaka data fortress where engrams are stored. Fast forward to 2077, and after a series of convoluted events, Johnny's engram was placed on a prototype biochip known as the Relic, which V and Jackie Wells managed to steal, but at a considerable cost.
See you in the major leagues, Jack.
In order to keep the chip from deteriorating, V shoved the chip in their shard slot, before getting shot in the head by Dexter Deshawn. Sometime later, the Relic, still slotted in V's head, revived them, but in doing so also awakened Johnny's engram, which began to overwrite and take over V's consciousness, albeit unwillingly. After initial struggle, Johnny decides to cooperate with V in the hopes that he can be safely removed from V's head and they can all go on living all hunky-dory. And so, throughout V's journey to save themselves from being overwritten and losing their mind, we have Johnny as a constant companion, someone who pops up from time to time either to help guide us or to give his often colorful opinion on things. At certain points in the story, we'll get extended dialogue sequences between V and Johnny, assuming V, per your decisions, doesn't decide to shut him up with Omega blockers provided by Victor Vector. They're by far among the best moments you have with Johnny, as they provide a chance to get to know the man inside V's head, to learn what motivated him back in the day and still motivates him now, even as he's trapped in V's head. There's so much emotion in him, a chaotic passion for what he believes, with V able to agree or disagree based on your choices.
Might be right. Can't really argue with you there.
Based on these instances, you'd be right to believe that Johnny, even as a digitized vision only V can see, is still very much alive. Outside of still having his own mind, he can also still feel pain, as evidenced during the main quest, Lightning Breaks. Yet, at various points throughout, it's stated rather clearly that the Johnny we see isn't actually him. The engram Soul Killer creates is just a shell of that individual's personality, for Soul Killer lives up to its name and kills the soul, leaving only an empty husk behind that eventually dies. What we see of Johnny is just a copy of the old Johnny Silverhand, a digitized ghost implanted on the biochip now slotted in V's head, overwriting their own consciousness. And yet, for a ghost that's just a copy of the original individual, Johnny appears very much alive when we speak to him. He has feelings and motivations, is able to act of his own free will, even if that involves taking over V's mind from time to time, can feel pain and grief, and even goes through an amount of character growth, particularly in the story's later stages. You could say that he's of sound mind, even if that soundness is incredibly suspect. That would all suggest, even as a digitized ghost, that he's still human in some way, that he does indeed have a soul, despite what Soul Killer's ominous name would suggest. The same can then also be said for other engrams as well. Case in point, Saburo Arasaka, CEO and Emperor of the Arasaka Corporation. At the end of the main story, if you take up Hanako Arasaka on her offer, you'll get the chance to meet and speak with Saburo. This is due to Saburo making an engram of his psyche before his son Yorinobu got handsy with him during the heist. This is because, after the Corp forcibly acquired it from Alt Cunningham, Arasaka engineers were able to modify Soul Killer in a way that allowed for it to make an engram of a person without killing them. This was then commercialized as the Secure Your Soul program, where the ultra-wealthy, famous, and powerful could have copies of themselves made and saved in Mikoshi. This is done under the guise of achieving immortality, when in reality Arasaka was merely hoping to use these engrams for commercial means and to learn whatever secrets their clients might be keeping. Just as Johnny is, even as a digital construct, Saburo is still of sound mind with his own feelings and motivations. When brought before the Arasaka board, he's able to recall past conversations he's had with some of its members and do so with the same ruthless and merciless attitude as he had before he died. While it's incredibly dubious to say that he has a soul in the virtuous sense, if having a soul strictly means that he's able to make his own decisions or form his own opinions, then it would seem that he's very human in that regard. In that case, the same can be said for Johnny Silverhand or any other engram stuck in Mikoshi or on some biochip. The only exception would be Al Cunningham, Soul Killer's original creator and its first victim at Arasaka's hands. This is because she states rather clearly, once we meet her beyond the Black Wall, that she turned into an AI maintaining Alt's image due to reasons that are too complex to get into in this video. Needless to say, there's no inkling of humanity left. Adding to this messy merry-go-round are these two, Buddhist monks you encounter in Watson. Rescue one of them from Maelstrom and you can find them again in Japantown, where you can ask for their take on whether or not a construct really is a person, if they're human. Put simply, as they see it, if the construct can suffer, then they are a person. As pointed out before, and depending on the order you do missions prior to this meeting, Johnny has experienced some amount of suffering already. Where it gets tricky, however, is whether or not the construct is capable of reincarnation. If not, then can it truly be regarded as a being with a soul? After all, as already been mentioned a few times by now, Johnny, or any other construct for that matter, is really just a few lines of code, masquerading as the psyche of the individual from which it came from. Johnny's case being special in that he's trapped in V's mind as well as the relic. What makes this messier is that these two follow up this point with the aforementioned belief that if a construct can suffer, then it's a person, a human, and so round and round we continue on this headache-inducing merry-go-round. While this particular conversation is framed strictly in the context of Buddhist theology and rhetoric, it best exemplifies why there can be no definitive answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? As stated in the intro, it's too open-ended of a question to be strictly defined, with too many possible variables to consider, all of them right on one hand, yet wrong on the other, constantly contradicting one another. So, what is Johnny then? Is he a human, trapped in V's mind? Or is he a codified ghost, a transplanted figment of V's mind? Like every other philosophical question in this video, only you, the player, can truly answer this question.
Plan's perfect. Job like this comes 1 in a million.
Thanks. Now the punchline, please.
Just sounds too good to be true. What's the catch?
So, what is the point of this video? Or rather, what is the point of this discourse on what it is to be human? We live in a world now where every question needs an answer, and a satisfying one at that. There can be no gray area, no middle ground where we can dance on the fence in perpetuity. If there is no answer, then what is the point? And why Cyberpunk 2077? There are so many other games out there where this sort of conversation could easily apply, including consequently The Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red's previous title, which has been rightfully praised for its depiction of the moral ambiguity of its world and characters. But why Cyberpunk? I think it's for a reason that I don't think is immediately apparent. It's meant to be a warning. Allow me to explain and incidentally use The Witcher 3 as an example. The Witcher 3 is set in a heavily grounded fantasy world, one that is just as, if not more brutal than the world of Cyberpunk 2077, where even idealists and concepts of morality are highly questionable, yet conversely where some of its most heinous inhabitants can be redeemed in some way. But that's a fantasy world, full of magic and monsters, of elves, dwarves, and halflings, of sorcerers and sorceresses, and let's not forget the titular part of it, the Witchers, genetically enhanced monster slayers. As brilliant of a game as it is, one that has stuck with me and continues to be my all-time favorite, just gonna sneak that shameless plug in there, its fantastical elements do allow for a certain degree of separation from reality. While also laden with hard-to-believe elements, Cyberpunk 2077 and its tabletop predecessor share much more in common with our real world. Set Night City's neon facade side by side with that of Shibuya, Tokyo, at a glance you could say they're one and the same. Prosthetics have become more advanced in our time, slowly reaching the levels we see in-game, and neural implants, long in development, are beginning to see the light of day, and may be fashionable in the near future. At the societal level, corporate power and influence is greater than we've ever seen, with individual net worths exceeding that of some countries. Social inequality is at an all-time high and only continues to get worse. There's been a steady breakdown of law and order, along with a subtle yet noticeable erosion of true democracy, with only a facade left in its place. While it would be disingenuous to say that it's a surefire vision of the future, there's an air of familiarity in Cyberpunk 2077, where the line between our reality and this vision of the world in the future created by Mike Pondsmith, then built upon by CD Projekt Red, is rather blurred, even with its more out there sci-fi elements. It's in this that the warning comes to the fore. We may not have reached the precipice yet, and still have a chance to turn things around, but should we continue down this path towards what we've just described, we risk losing our humanity, that which makes us, our species, unique. Though there's plenty to be found in this world, it's often buried under a mountain of inhumanity. It is possible that we've already reached the aforementioned precipice, that we are destined for a future not unlike what we see in Cyberpunk. If that's the case, then the warning becomes a lesson, a key piece of advice. In the face of great cruelty, of the most powerful crushing the weakest and the most vulnerable, of metal and oil replacing flesh and blood, stay the course you're presently on. Stay human.